it's okay. Posso começar? Aparentemente posso, não é? Ok. Dear Professor Sandel, allow me just a brief words about the sections and some greetings to people who came and some gratitude I must express to several people. Well, let's start with the greeting and the gratitude to the Gulbenkian Foundation. Eu disse que ia fazer isto em português, está bom. Portanto, queria antes de mais agradecer ao Dr. Guilherme Oliveira Martins e à Fundação Gulbenkian, mas muito em especial ao Dr. Guilherme Oliveira Martins, que tanto auxiliou esta organização e contribuiu para que ela se pudesse fazer. Também ao Sr. Vice-Governador do Banco de Portugal, o Dr. Luís Máximo dos Santos, que igualmente apoiou esta iniciativa. Depois, permito-me cumprimentar e agradecer a presença do Sr. Presidente do Tribunal de Contas. Algumas pessoas ainda chegarão mais tarde, mas, portanto, vou-me só dirigir para já às que estão. Queria cumprimentar também, de um modo especial, os seus representantes do Chefe de Estado-Maior-General das Forças Armadas e do Chefe de Estado-Maior do Exército, e depois o Sr. Reitor da Universidade de Lisboa e os reitores de outras universidades e as equipas reitorais, a diretora da minha faculdade, claro está, com especial estima e gratidão também pela ajuda permanente, e o Sr. Presidente do Conselho Científico da minha faculdade, também ele, digamos, um apoiante firme. A senhora bastonária, não sei se já chegou, enfim, a visão da sala não é muito completa, portanto, como há que acelerar, vão permitir saudar-vos a todos genericamente e agradecer-vos. Bom, vamos então a isso. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you all today to hear from one of the most influential and thought-provoking thinkers of our time, Professor Michael J. Sandel, with a distinguished career of spanning over 4 decades. Professor Sandel has established himself as one of the world's leading political philosophers, thanks to his engaging and insightful perspectives on some of the most pressing ethical and moral questions facing our societies today. Professor Sandel's course, Justice, was taught to thousands of students at Harvard University before becoming the university's first freely available online and on television course, which helped it capture the imagination of millions of people around the world. In Portugal, his critique of John Rawls' A Theory of Justice is a part of the National High School program for philosophy, and his body of work is on the program of all the university's philosophy courses. Also, 4 of his books were translated into Portuguese. The first of them was Liberalismo e os Limites da Justiça, curiosamente publicado pela Fundação Calouste Gulbenkian. Os mais recentes, publicados pela editora Presença, que tem prestado uma grande atenção à obra do professor Michael Sandel. In the challenging times we face, he has played a significant role in shaping a public ethic framework and exploring avenues for creating more equitable societies, where the collective good The common good is paramount and individual achievements are valued only insofar as they occur within a decent society. The Institute for Economical, Fiscal and Financial Affairs of the Law School of Lisbon has been engaged in the same fight, organizing dozens of conferences and seminars and publishing books on the subject. We are particularly proud of our work during a pivotal moment in our recent history, when we were one of the most active voices in questioning austerity and the politics dictated by Troika. Today's conference is one more step in our work towards creating a more just society. Meritocracy has become an elusive instrument to maintain inequality, crafting the idea that those who do not succeed are to blame, because they lack the necessary capacities. This fallacy ignores the different starting position of the rich and poor and creates the conviction that everyone can triumph only by their own efforts. In practice, it conserves societal difference and creates forms of discrimination that are becoming ever more radical. The success of meritocratic ideas is based on a superficial vision driven by thoughts that things were worse when merit was ignored. While many social democrats like Tony Blair, Bill and Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama have reinforced this idea, it is far from consensual. In fact, let's remember, for instance, Hannah Arendt, that considered that meritocracy contradicts egalitarian democracy in the same way that any other oligarchy does. Meritocracy has an ironic history. Michael Young, an influential intellectual of the British Labour Party, who later abandoned it, wrote The Rise of Meritocracy in 1958. He was somehow the creator of the expression meritocracy. And this book he wrote became extraordinarily popular. And, well, he had lots of pain in publishing the book. He should see 11 or 12 publishers before a friend of him published, and as he used to say, oh, I'm glad that finally that friend that was helping me was helped by the huge sales of my book. But the success of the book was in great part the result of a misunderstanding. Michael Young was attacking meritocracy, but people thought that he was trying to promote meritocracy. As I told, he left the Labour Party, and many years later, near the end of last century, he died, but before dying, he wrote in The Guardian an article called Down with Meritocracy, where he wondered whether anything could be done about this more polarized meritocratic society. He reached three conclusions. We should revive local government to further involve people in politics, increase the taxes on the rich, and finally, Mr. Blair and all the leaders who didn't fully understand the concept of meritocracy should, and I quote, drop the word from their public vocabulary. 2 decades later, none of these things seem to have happened thus far, but debate about mediocrity remains of the utmost importance. Today we are very honored to have Professor Sandel here to share his insights on this vital topic. We are also thrilled to have the participation of José Barata Moura, Alexandre Quintanilha, and Maria Emília Brederode Santos, three exceptional citizens with extraordinary passes of service to the common good, who will contribute to the debate, to which we hope you will also join us. Professor Sandel will start with a keynote speech. Then the debaters will make short interventions. Professor Sandel will answer, comment what he feels is important, and then he will still have some time to discuss with the audience in general. Without further ado, please welcome Professor Michael J. Sandel.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Paz Ferreira, for that warm and generous introduction, which reminded me that the first book I wrote, which was actually based, it was my doctoral dissertation, Liberalism and the Limits of Justice. It was the most difficult book to read, maybe also to write, that the Gulbenkian Foundation published that book, the most difficult book, many, many years ago. So I'm very grateful to the foundation for that connection and for this invitation. And when Professor Eduardo spoke about the ironic fact that Michael Young's book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, was very popular because people liked meritocracy and so wanted to buy a book about the rise of meritocracy, even though it was a critique. It reminded me of an experience I had some years ago when I was in China giving talks about a book I wrote called What Money Can't Buy: The Moral Limits of Markets. The editor, my editor with the Chinese press that had published my books, told me, riding in a car between events, that the publisher had some difficulty getting permission to publish my previous book on justice. But they said, we didn't have any trouble at all getting permission to publish this book, What Money Can't Buy: The Moral Limits of Markets. I asked them why. They said, because here in China, we love markets. So the Michael Young story that Professor Eduardo told brought that amusing incident to mind. Today I would like to discuss with you and with this very distinguished panel of colleagues the following question. Why is it that in our time our politics is so divided? Why there is so much anger and rancor and bitterness in our public life? The answer I propose is that it has something to do with a seemingly attractive ideal, the ideal of meritocracy. Now, how is it possible to think of merit as a kind of tyranny? We commonly think of merit as a good thing. If I need surgery, I want a well-qualified surgeon to perform it. That's merit, being well-qualified for the job. If I'm flying in an airplane, I want a well-qualified pilot. That's merit. So how can merit become a kind of tyranny? Surely it's better than allocating social roles and opportunities on the basis of a hereditary aristocracy. Surely it's better than allocating jobs based on nepotism or clientelism or prejudice. So how can merit become a kind of tyranny? To see how it's possible, we need to look back over the last 4 or 5 decades. During this time, the divide between winners and losers in our societies has been deepening, poisoning our politics, setting us apart. This has partly to do with the widening inequalities of income and wealth that this era of market-driven globalization has produced. But it's not only that. It has also to do, I think, with the changing attitudes toward success that have accompanied the rising inequalities. Those who've landed on top have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and that they therefore deserve the full bounty that the market bestows upon them. And, by implication, that those who struggle must deserve their fate too. Now, this way of thinking about success, where does it come from? It arises from a seemingly attractive ideal, which brings us back to the principle of meritocracy. The principle of meritocracy, simply put, is this: insofar as chances are equal, the winners deserve their winnings. Now, we all know that in our societies, chances are not truly equal. We don't fully live up to the meritocratic principles we profess. In OECD countries, taken as a whole, children whose parents did not complete secondary school have only a 15% chance of making it to university, compared to a 60% chance if young people have at least one parent who attended university. 15% to 60%. A 25-year-old university-educated man can expect to live longer than his lower-educated peers across OECD countries. How much longer? 8 years longer. So we know that however much we might strive for genuine equality of opportunity, chances are not truly equal. Consider the opportunity to rise, the chances for social mobility, one generation to the next. Most children born to low-income parents wind up poor as adults. That's true in the US. It's true in most European countries. Some European countries, especially in Scandinavia, have not only greater measures of equality, but greater chances for mobility than in the US, for example. In Denmark, the number of generations it would take someone born in the bottom 10% to reach the median income, the number of generations it would take, only 2 In the US, on average, it would take 5 generations. In Portugal, also 5 generations, according to the OECD. So we certainly don't have perfect upward mobility or equality of opportunity. But that's not the only problem with meritocracy. There's a deeper problem, which is that the ideal itself is flawed. It has a dark side. The dark side is that meritocracy, even a perfectly realized meritocracy, is corrosive of the common good. Why? Because it leads to hubris among the winners and to humiliation for those who lose out. It encourages the successful to inhale too deeply of their own success, to forget the luck and good fortune that helped them on their way, to forget their indebtedness to those who made their achievements, our achievements, possible. Families, teachers, neighbors, communities, country. It leads to forgetfulness about indebtedness. And because it encourages the successful to believe that they've made it on their own, it leads those on top to look down on those less fortunate than themselves. Now, there are at least 2 moral objections to the idea that even if chances were equal, the winners would deserve their winnings. We hear it time and time again from mainstream politicians. What we seek, they say, is a society where everyone has a chance to rise as far as their effort and talent will take them. How often have we heard this slogan? And at one level, who could disagree? Who could disagree with the idea that everyone should be able to rise as far as their efforts and talents will take them? I call this the rhetoric of rising. But, well, there's something very attractive about the principle. Because we do believe that people who work hard should be rewarded for their effort. But, well, why? Why should people be rewarded for their effort? Because trying hard, working hard, that's our responsibility. It displays the virtue of effort and hard work. But the slogan is about efforts and talents, as far as your efforts and talents will take you. What about talents? Are our talents our own doing, or are they our good luck? To test this question about the moral status of talents, let's consider a concrete example. Let's consider an example of someone who's very successful and very talented. Cristiano Ronaldo. He's very successful, we know that. He's famous, but also, he's pretty well paid. How much does he get paid now? Do you know? You know?
It's almost impossible to know because there are all these sponsors that
6 or 7 figures.
Yeah, to be sure.
6 or 7 figures. No. 9 figures. 9 figures. His new contract. You haven't kept up with, He just signed a contract for around $200 million. Now, does he deserve, well, let's put it in another way. $200 million. That's even more than Lionel Messi makes, who only makes about half that, about 100 million. But here's the thought experiment. Think of the best high school teacher you had when you were in school. You can probably remember his or her name. I can remember the name of my best teacher in school. Actually, it was the teacher who taught me European history. And I can remember her name. She was very tough, very conservative woman, actually. Very tough, demanding, and a wonderful teacher. Intimidating, but a great teacher. Now, can you call to mind your most influential teacher? Now, how much did that teacher make per year? What do you think? What would you guess? Just call it out. How much? How much do you think? What is the average teacher in?
3 figures, 4 figures?
No, it's 5 figures, but it's about 30 or 40 a year. I'm sorry, per year. I'm sorry. You were thinking per month. Yeah. Per year, because we want to make a comparison with Ronaldo, after all. So it's around between 30 and 40,000 euros per year. Now, let's just take a poll, a survey of people's opinion or moral intuitions. How many people would say that Ronaldo deserves to make more than 2,000 times what your best school teacher made? How many would say he does not deserve to make 2,000 times as much? Raise your hand. Does not. And how many disagree? How many say that a case can be made that Ronaldo deserves to make 2,000 times as much? All right, let's hear. We have microphones. Would someone whose hand is up now, go ahead, stand up and tell us why. And you can give your answer in English or in Portuguese, as you wish.
I think that the question isn't whether Ronaldo deserves or not to be paid the 2,000 times what a teacher is paid. The question is whether the system allows it to be like that, and our system, so capitalism, rewards rarity, and there are many, many more teachers than Cristiano Ronaldo's. So my argument isn't whether it's merited. My argument is based on what the system rewards, and the system being the way it is, that is what is fair according to our system. I don't necessarily agree with the system, but...
Okay, and what's your name?
Francisco.
Francisco. So Francisco says that capitalism rewards rarity, rare talents. Ronaldo's talents are more rare than the talents of, what was your school teacher's name, your best teacher? Francisco. Rita? Rita. All right. Now, Rita's talents were rare, but not as rare as Ronaldo's. Is that what you're saying?
More or less.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that, Francisco. Now, let's hear, the majority of people here said Well, and Francisco added something important when he said, that's what the system rewards now, rare talents. But Francisco isn't sure whether he thinks that's a just system of reward, but that's the way the system works. Now, actually, you still have the microphone, Francisco?
I do.
Okay, stand up once more. May I ask you a follow-up question?
Of course.
Okay. I read about a person who is the greatest arm wrestler in the world. You know, in bars, in pubs, people compete in arm wrestling. You know what I'm referring to.
Yeah, have you?
And do you know the name of this person, this great arm wrestler?
No idea, no.
Right, I don't remember his name either. But he has a rare talent. He is the best arm wrestler in the world.
Yes.
So, would you say that Ronaldo deserves, and now he doesn't get paid much at all. I don't think there's much money in arm wrestling in pubs.
Yes, but the system, you have to take into account how much money he brings to, I wouldn't say his owners, but his owners.
Very little, very little.
You think so? Because I had never seen a Arab League match before Ronaldo went there, and that's what he's bringing to his owners. That's the value he's having to the people who are paying him. So
right, which is not very much value, apparently. There are a few people who kind of like to watch the arm wrestling, but not a lot of people, and they're not willing to pay very much for it. The talent, if he really is the greatest in the world, the talent of this nameless arm wrestling champion is just as rare as Ronaldo's, but now Francisco has added a further factor. There isn't much demand. There's not much consumer demand to watch arm wrestling, where there is enormous consumer demand to watch football. So, rarity of talent and a lot of demand, a lot of social value derived from watching the display of Ronaldo's talents, it seems to generate this enormous reward. Well, let's thank Francisco for getting our discussion going. Thank you for that. Now, who disagrees with Francisco and would like to tell us why? There's a woman sitting right across the aisle. Yes, toward the aisle. Stand up. Yes, right there. Yes.
Yes, I disagree with Francisco because I think that the system that we are, capitalism, is not fair at all. So it's very difficult to think about something that is fair or just or inside the system.
And first, tell us your name.
Anna.
Anna. And so you say that Ronaldo does not deserve to make 2,000 times more than either Francisco's teacher or yours.
First of all, Ronaldo deserves to be in jail for what he did, but okay. Let's go with that. And yes, he doesn't deserve to win that much.
But why?
Because I think there are other kind of professions and other kind of professionals that we really need, like the pandemic show us, that's really necessary for the society to live, for people to live, that deserve to be much better paid than Ronaldo.
It's interesting. Anna reminds us of the people we relied on, the workers we relied on during that pandemic. And we were very grateful to them at the time. The value of their contribution was very widely recognized. You're thinking of what sorts of workers, or Anna?
I'm thinking about people that work at supermarkets, that do like all the logistics for us to have food,
Right.
medical people, not just doctors and nurses, but
Right.
all the medical people that
Right.
we need.
Nurse
Like
assistants, delivery workers who brought food to our door.
Exactly, people that works at, I don't know, the electric system, all the goods that we need to live our days, our life.
And so we were grateful to these workers at the time. We called them essential workers, key workers. And yet they don't get paid very much for the most part. They certainly don't get paid what Ronaldo does. And you think that's unfair?
Yes.
And what do you say to Francisco's argument, Anna, that
I think
the market rewards rare talents that are in very high demand?
I think that the market should not be our way to see what is fair or not fair, because markets are not fair for anyone.
Do you think that the market valuation of a job is not a true measure of the value of that job, the
Yes,
value of the
in moral
contribution?
terms, it's not.
Okay, thank you for that. So let's thank Anna for giving a powerful counter-argument. So Anna is challenging an assumption that we commonly make. In fact, it's an assumption that's very difficult sometimes to resist. And that's the assumption that the money people make is the measure of the value of their contribution to the economy or to the common good. And Anna, you say that that assumption is false. Yes? Which raises, if Anna's right about that, that raises a difficult question. If the market doesn't tell us what really counts as a valuable contribution to the economy or to the common good, how can we decide the true value of what a teacher does, or a nurse, or a delivery worker, or a grocery store clerk, or a football player? Anna says, from a moral point of view, there's no reason to accept the market's verdict on social value. But if Anna's right about that, that suggests that we, presumably as democratic citizens, have to debate the question of what counts as a valuable contribution among ourselves and try to come up with some convincing answers. And that's not an easy thing to do, especially because different people value different things, different contributions. We disagree about what's valuable. We disagree about lots of moral questions, but certainly questions of value. And so, in the face of disagreement about value and conceptions of the good, because what counts as a valuable contribution depends on contestable conceptions of the common good, and for that matter, of the good life. If we're to take Anna's proposal seriously, we have to engage, even as democratic citizens, with that difficult philosophical debate. It isn't easy, but if Anna's right, maybe that's a debate we can't avoid or shouldn't try to avoid. Now, how does this bear on the question of meritocracy? Well, it bears on meritocracy because meritocracy presents itself as one answer to the question, what is a just society? Who deserves what and why? And to answer those questions, it seems we have to answer the question, what counts as a valuable contribution. Because if we really believe in honoring and rewarding merit, we must have some idea about the relative value of the teacher's contribution and of Ronaldo's. So these are some of the philosophical challenges to the idea that in a perfect meritocracy, those whose talents reap them great rewards morally deserve those rewards. And a further reason to question the idea that that exercising my talents gives rise to deservingness, has to do with something else that's come out in this discussion, which is the fact that Ronaldo is a gifted athlete. That's not his doing, that's his good luck. It's true, he practices hard, he works hard. But I could practice even more hours than Ronaldo practices and not be nearly as good a football player. Me too. You too. You've tried. I haven't tried I tried with baseball when I was a kid. I thought maybe I'd be a great baseball player. I loved baseball, but it's difficult. For me, it was. So effort alone is not decisive. It's talents, it's gifts. And being gifted, that's not one's own doing. That's a matter of luck. Not only having the talent, but here's a second moral contingency, living in a society and at a time that generates the demand Francisco was referring to. Is it Ronaldo's doing that he lives at a time and in a society where people love football? Or is that too his good luck? If Ronaldo had lived back in the days of the Renaissance, people didn't love football as much back then. They cared more about fresco painters. So even if he were as gifted then as he is now, he wouldn't have made nearly as much. So there are two elements of luck: being gifted in the first place and being gifted with the talents and abilities that happen to be rewarded or prized at any given moment. So these are some reasons from a moral point of view to question the underlying meritocratic principle, even if we could live up to it. Now, why then is merit nonetheless so attractive? I think for two reasons. First, the idea that we earn our fate, or could if circumstances were fair, that's powerfully attractive. Because it suggests an idea of human freedom, of human agency. We would like to believe that where we end up in life is the result of what we've done or could do. So there's an idea of human agency and freedom. And there's something comforting in the thought that we get what we deserve, or would if only opportunities were equal. Now, this appeal of meritocracy did not begin with Michael Young's giving the name meritocracy to these aspirations. The meritocratic ideal goes back a very long way. In early Christian debates, there was an argument about not income and wealth, not whether we deserve income and wealth, but on whether salvation is something we earn or something we receive or don't receive as a gift of God's grace. This was a debate that roiled Christian theology for centuries. Can the faithful earn salvation through religious observance and good works? Or is salvation entirely a matter of God's grace? Augustine said the second. He thought it was blasphemy to believe that God was somehow bound to honor the good works that I perform or my faithfulness, because that would undermine the idea of God's omnipotence. And yet, there is a powerful tendency to assume that in the religious context, if we are faithful to God's demands, and if we live in accordance with religious observance and duties, the observance of rites, it's tempting to think that God will look favorably on us. It's hard to reject that idea. And by the time of the Reformation, the idea of earning salvation, or even in the case of indulgences, buying it, had gathered a certain kind of momentum. And then Martin Luther came along and argued against this idea as a kind of corruption. In a way, the Protestant Reformation was born as a kind of renunciation of merit. This was Luther's point. Salvation isn't something that we earn by our own doing. And Calvin, John Calvin, after Luther, took the same position. But here's a paradox. The Puritans who went to the New World took this Calvinist idea with them, and they created what came to be known, Max Weber described as the Protestant work ethic, that generated a very powerful meritocratic understanding of salvation. And the way it happened was, to make a long story short, Calvin taught that who would be saved was predestined. It didn't depend on what we did here on earth. It was predestined. But we all have a duty to work in a calling for God's greater glory. And those who work hard and whose hard work is rewarded by material success can see their success and their hard work as a sign that they've been marked for salvation. Calvin's idea was not that the hard work was a source of salvation, or that material success was a source, but it was a sign. So here's how the Protestant ethic got going. It produced anxious work, because work and material success would be a sign that I'd been predestined for salvation. But it proved difficult, psychologically and theologically, to resist the slide from believing that disciplined work and material success was a sign of salvation, to believing that it was also had to be a source of salvation. It's hard to bear the notion that God will take no notice of faithful work that increases his glory. Once I'm encouraged to infer from my good works that I am among the elect, it's hard to resist the thought that my good works have contributed to my election. So the idea of salvation by works, which is a meritocratic idea, something I earn, came to the fore. And this led to, with the Protestant work ethic, gave rise not only to the spirit of capitalism, that was Max Weber's great insight. The Protestant ethic also promotes an ethic of self-help and responsibility for one's fate congenial to meritocratic ways of thinking. It leads to anxious, energetic striving that generates great wealth. That's how it fuels the rise of capitalism. But it also reveals the dark side of an excessive view of responsibility and self-making. Here's why. The humility prompted by helplessness in the face of grace gives way to the hubris prompted by belief in one's own merit. So for Luther and Calvin and the Puritans, debates about merit were about salvation. Did the chosen earn and therefore deserve their election, or is salvation a gift of grace beyond our control? That was their question. For us, debates about merit are about worldly success. Do the successful earn and therefore deserve their success, or is prosperity due to factors beyond our control? Now, it's tempting to attribute the triumph of the ethic of mastery and merit and self-making to the secular bent of our time. But even today, our attitudes towards success may not be as independent of providential faith as we sometimes think. The notion that we are free human agents capable of rising and succeeding by our own effort is one aspect of meritocracy. Equally important is the conviction that those who succeed deserve their success. As Francisco argued, that's the way the system works. And that's the ethic that the system presupposes and promotes. Max Weber, 100 years ago, glimpsed this. The fortunate person, he wrote, is seldom satisfied with the fact of being fortunate. Beyond this, he needs to know that he has a right to his good fortune. He wants to be convinced that he deserves it, and above all, that he deserves it in comparison with others. He wants to be allowed the belief that the less fortunate also merely experience their due. That was Max Weber, 100 years ago, before Michael Young wrote about the rise of the meritocracy. The tyranny of merit arises from this impulse. Today's secular meritocratic order moralizes success in ways that echo the earlier providential faith. Although we don't generally think that the successful owe their power and wealth to divine intervention, some people think so, but not in the culture as a whole. We still assume that the successful rise thanks to their own effort and hard work. We still think that their success reflects their superior virtue. The rich are rich because they are more deserving than the poor. This way of thinking heightens the moral stakes of economic competition. It sanctifies the winners and denigrates the losers, which brings us back to the tyranny of merit. Now, we may have a chance in the discussion to follow to discuss possible alternative ethics. If the rhetoric of rising, if the meritocratic ideal, if even the ideal of equality of opportunity is insufficient to bring about a just society, what alternative ethic, what alternative principle would be more adequate to a just society? What alternative ethic is worth trying to bring to bear on contemporary public life? And I hope we'll have a chance with the panel to discuss this. I would simply say, before turning to my colleagues for their thoughts and their challenges, that over the past 4 decades, market-driven globalization and the meritocratic conception of success taken together have encouraged us to believe that the successful make it on their own. And this has eroded the moral and civic basis for solidarity and mutual obligation. Global supply chains and outsourcing and unfettered capital flows and the deregulation of finance, all of these familiar episodes from the last 4 decades, have taken together made us less reliant on our fellow citizens, less grateful for the work they do, less open to the claims of solidarity. The meritocratic sorting machine that universities have become have begun to teach us that our success is our own doing, have eroded our sense of indebtedness. Insisting that my success is my due makes it hard to see myself in other people's shoes. Appreciating the role of luck in life, appreciating my indebtedness, can prompt a certain humility. There, but for the accident of birth, or the grace of God, or the mystery of fate, go I. That could be me. This spirit of humility is the civic virtue we need now. It's the beginning of the way back from the harsh ethic of success that drives us apart. It points beyond the tyranny of merit, possibly toward a less rancorous, less polarized, more generous public life. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
To comment is to engage oneself in a process of thinking together, starting from someone else's thoughts. The richness of the lecture we have just listened to leads the way to different sorts of commentaries, even if, in what regards me, the comments are poor. To criticize is not to speak ill of whatever is the case, but to try to conceive it well. In this sense, critique is a main feature of philosophical thinking and an indispensable companion to rationality, something of which we all are proud, but to which we do not always pay the due attention. Michael Sandel's speech displays an opportune and accurate dismounting of the frame of ideas intended to inculcate in the dominant ideology of common sense, meritocracy, credentialism, and so forth. It contains also a substantial and vivid reminder of the core dimension of community inherent not only to everyday human life, but to a qualified, humane living. Nevertheless, from my perspective, the issues at stake are not chiefly moral, but basically ontological. We do not get rid of actual being by juxtaposing to it an ideal order of what ought to be, what Kant called sollen, dever ser em português. Effective change involves practice, material transformation of being, historically driven by a whole set of struggles, economical, social, political, cultural, within which the individual ethical commitments take place along of enlarged collective movements. Democratizing education plays, for sure, an important role in the adventures of an enriched human emancipation. However, despite the good intention of Helvetius or Robert Owen, education does not play the leading or the decisive role in the process of transforming society as a whole. Bourgeois ideology, since the 15th century at least, bet on the introjection of guilt under the theological and religious umbrella of Calvinism mainly. The celestial salvation of the souls is a discretionary gift from God. But worldly success in business betrays a good sign of the divine favor. The stage is properly set for the euphoria of the winners, the depressive mood of the losers, the resentment of the masses left behind, and for a contradictory general distress. After the overthrow of the illusions and fallacies of meritocracy, still some questions must be asked. Does any room remain for self-endeavor? Are we ineluctably condemned to the frailties, the postmodern debilidad of our human condition? Does everything depend only on good fortune and the randomness of luck? Accountability is not a legal and moral device only for the allocation of punishments and rewards. The core of responsibility concerns the design, the authorship, and the thickness of what we do with our lives. Not in the starry skies of will, wishes, and longings, but in the stormy weather, within a framework of inherited and conflicting conditions, which nevertheless are able to be transformed. Not in the loneliness of a private nomadism, departed from the ensemble of social relationships within which our very singularity occurs, but together with others, in a relational process of discovery and transforming of the world, of life, and of ourselves. In order to transform, study and understanding of the dynamics of realities are needed, though they do not replace individual, group, and collective organized practice. Social recognition of and a kind esteem for the oppressed may change the general environment of perception, but do not deal with or address the roots of exploitation beneath the phenomena of globalism. Humility and patience do not imply resignation or belief in the miraculous effect of enhancing shared axiological standards. Perhaps the laboring of hope, trabalho da esperança, is the difficult but unavoidable task of a revolutionary attitude, which does not sacrifice in the present the future of movement, but tries to lay among the complexities of existence some real possibilities for the movement to have a future. Of course, there is no moral, political, or intellectual obligation in agreeing with me. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, let me start by thanking Eduardo Paz Ferreira and Michael Sandel for inviting me to be here today. And I would say it for two reasons. First, because they've accepted to have a theoretical physicist talking about issues that have a little bit to do with technology, but have a lot more to do with politics. I guess it's because I've been in politics in the last few years that you've invited me. But I'd like to thank Michael Sandel for writing and for talking to us and for giving us a lecture which even a theoretical physicist can understand. Let me also say that in reading many of your books, I came always to try to make a comparison with what was happening in Portugal. And Portugal at present is very different from the United States, but I am very afraid that it may be moving in the same direction. I am very concerned about that. And I will tell you why I think it's very different. Has to do with two issues. One was the way in which we dealt with the pandemic. We have a population that is over 95% vaccinated.
we had very few deniers. We had a few, but they no longer get the attention of the media. And so we don't have someone like the guy with orange hair that was in the White House for several years and who recommended that we should inject ourselves with all sorts of things to cure the pandemic. So it's different. We have a different, Portugal is different. And a very recent result from one of the Eurobarometers that are done usually every few years has also confirmed that Portugal, within some 30 countries, including those in the European Union, is in first place when it comes to the belief that knowledge is able to resolve problems. I was amazed. If this Eurobarometer had been done 30 years ago, we would be probably in the tail end. Now we are number one. But let me get back to your book that I've read several times now. And I want to make a few comments. And I want to focus, because you didn't talk very much during your talk about the role of technology and technocracy. But let me start with chapter 1. I'm not going to talk about all the chapters, by the way. In the Tyranny of Merit, you remind us of Michael Young's, and you've talked about that, and it's been mentioned a couple of times. That was published, The Rise of Meritocracy was published 65 years ago. And I want to come to this number when I want to compare this to advances in other areas of science, where he says, for those who feel aggrieved by the tyranny of merit, the problem is not only stagnant wages, but also the loss of social esteem. And I think this is a big message in your book, this loss of social esteem. And you go on to make several comments, namely that mainstream parties and elites miss this particular dimension of politics. They think that the problem with market-driven globalization is simply a matter of distributive justice. And I think your book makes a very good case for it's not just that. That it misunderstands the populist complaint and reflects a defect in the technocratic approach to governing. And also, namely, that conducting our public discourse as if it were possible to outsource moral and political judgments to markets or to experts and technocrats has emptied democratic argument of meaning and purpose. And you end up by stating, and I put this in bold here because this is very important, I think, such vacuums of public meaning are invariably filled, these vacuums are filled with harsh authoritarian forms of identity and belonging, whether in the form of religious fundamentalism or strident nationalism. I think this is very true for the United States. I think it's very true for a number of other countries. We are getting there in Portugal, and I'm very afraid of it. This emphasis on identities and belonging and nationalism, which we see rising everywhere. Now, it reminded me of two books, one by Martin Jay, where he talks about the virtues of mendacity, a wonderful book that I also read several times, and David Runciman's How Democracy Ends, published the first one in 2010, the other one in 2018. And they alert us to the danger of an increased technocratic approach to governing. And I could not help resist thinking that it was also in 1958, and now it's my scientist bit coming out. In 1958, the same year that Michael Young's book was published. It was in that year that Roger Revelle asked Charles Keeling to start measuring CO2 levels in Mauna Loa to understand climate change. 65 years ago. And I've also mentioned here, we've been warned for more than 6 decades now, not only about the dangers of meritocracy, but also about climate change and greenhouse gases. But very little has changed. In fact, I think it's become worse. CO2 today is increasing 3 times faster than it was 30 years ago. Even though there's been 30 conferences of parts where all the countries get together. And so this analogy between the messages that we are receiving and the fact that we do nothing about them is very disturbing for me. Why? What can we do to change that? I don't know. Maybe we can discuss that a little later. Halfway through chapter 4, you claim that survey research bears out what many working class voters sensed at a time when racism and sexism are out of favor, and then you put between brackets, discredited though not eliminated, credentialism is the last acceptable prejudice. And it's incredibly strong. I never heard this stated in this way, but it touched me greatly. It's true. And moreover, the elites are unembarrassed by their prejudice. They may denounce racism and sexism, but are unapologetic about their attitudes towards the less educated. The suggestion that education is a universal social problem solver may do several things. Strengthen the ideology of meritocracy, making people more willing to accept inequality and more likely to believe that success reflects merit. Later in this chapter, you make 2 claims, which also disturbed me. You say one of the casualties of meritocracy's triumph may be the loss of broad public support for higher education. And I think this is true in the United States. It is not yet true in Portugal, but I'm very afraid that it might become true shortly. And the second one is that for meritocratic elites, the rhetoric of smart and dumb seems to offer a non-partisan alternative to moral and ideological disagreement. And you give an example. You give Obama's belief that the primary source of democratic disagreement is that ordinary citizens lack sufficient information. We propagate this idea very often. Those who defend the existence of technological assessment of countries believe that those who don't agree with us, it's just because they don't have enough facts, or they don't understand the facts, or it's too complicated for them to understand the facts. And I feel that these positions have become more pronounced. And my question is, am I wrong? I hope so, but I don't think so. And I'm also a little bit concerned of the danger of throwing out the baby with the bathwater when it comes to the education. Education, you know, the desire to know more and the desire that knowledge is going to help us in some way is a very powerful conquest of democracies. And I feel that it's under threat at the moment. People all over the world are questioning that. Let me end by going back to your book, and there was this thing of technocracy disturbed me a great deal, and there's a very brief, I want to end with that, because I think it's true, and I think it represents a lack of the capacity for dialogue between different areas of knowledge. We have become so specialized that it's very difficult to discourse and to talk to people of different areas. They just use a different language. Attributing political disagreement to a simple refusal to face facts, this is you in your book, or accept science, misunderstands the interplay of facts and opinion in political persuasion. The idea that we should all agree on the facts as a pre-political baseline and then proceed to debate our opinions and convictions is a technocratic conceit. I confess that I'm guilty to some extent. I've learned something from my colleagues, but I still feel a little bit of that. Political debate is often about how to identify and characterize the facts relevant to the controversy in question. Whoever succeeds in framing the facts is already a long way to winning the argument. Moynihan, to the contrary, this is somebody, I don't think this is really important, but I think the point you make is that if you frame the facts, then you already have won the battle. And I think a lot of people who come from the hard sciences have difficulty in understanding this. It took me a long time to understand this. You know, facts are facts, but the ones you choose to start the argument are very important in terms of the argument. But this isn't something that is well understood in a community, in a university community, which requires that there should be dialogue between. There is no dialogue these days. Everybody closes themselves in their little narrow area and just publishes, and is very pleased to publish one paper every 36 hours, like I heard a few days ago. So thank you, Michael, for bringing us this to our attention. I was very grateful, and I will read your book a third time. Thank you.
Ui, tirar isto. Estou um bocado atrapalhada, não é? Mas boa tarde a todos. I'd like to start by greeting Michael Sandel, thanking him very much for making me read his book and making me see his interview last night to public television. And now the pleasure of having heard him so brilliantly expose his ideas. I also would like to thank Eduardo Paz Ferreira, of course, and the IDEF, who is constantly bringing up ideas and challenges and very defying problems for us to think through, and very out of what is usual. I think that's very, very important. I, of course, greet also my colleagues and thank them for their splendid intervention. I think I'm the last one, not only so that you can go out, but also because maybe Eduardo had in mind that that idea of Barata Moura that working hope is the revolutionary work that we can do. And education is always a work of hope. I am not so hopeful as all that, but still, I think that is a principle. Anyway, I would like to say that I read Professor Sandel's ideas with amazement and at the same time recognition. Amazement because my memories of the 1 year that I spent in the United States when I was 16, and this was in the transition between the 50s and the 60s, living in an American family, going to an American public school in South California. And the fact that what I appreciated most in American society, in that place and in those days, was the dignity that every single person seemed to have, the feeling of being a citizen that I, at the time, attributed to the fact that they lived in a democracy, and while Portugal was under Salazar's dictatorship. It struck me that while in Lisbon, in the building I lived, they put an elevator. That was a big event. But at the same time as they put the elevator, they put a little note saying, this elevator is for the exclusive usage of the residents and their guests. Service people, please use the back stairs. And this, in my town in the United States, was completely impossible. Of course, it was called Manhattan Beach, and every worker seemed to be appreciated. There was places for everyone to meet and enjoy and have fun together. I remember particularly a picnic where the lady who did the cleaning of the houses and of the offices came with the school librarian. The Hungarian refugee met her future husband there, who was a NASA physicist. And my foster sister, an American from a WASP background, came with her Mexican boyfriend. So I know this sounds very idyllic, but I wasn't living in Harlem, and I wasn't living in the Mississippi, and I wasn't living in the big cities of New York or Chicago. I was living in a small town in the south of Los Angeles, a recent town that had been built by the residents in large part, and who were not, and these were neither millionaires nor from minorities. They were common people, workers without high qualifications. The house I stayed in, for example, impressed me because there were no books, but who lived well and who often had built their own homes, sometimes even with their own hands, and they seemed to feel proud and content and cared about the others and about their community and about the world. And that's why, for example, they had a Portuguese girl stay for 1 year because they thought they were contributing for a more peaceful world. So I was amazed that this society that seemed so much more egalitarian than mine in Portugal had become so much more similar. You see, in that old Portugal, which ended 49 years ago, and we are celebrating it, very few had access to higher education. Those few came obviously from families well educated and mostly well off, and had a special treatment. They were called doctors, right? A higher education diploma, for us it was a license which is between BA and MA, gave us the right to be called doctor, so-and-so, and this treatment had nothing to do with medical training. So we amused ourselves saying that we were a country of doctors, and we still are, actually. So, as I was saying, I was amazed at your strange evolution, but I could recognize well the separating line between those who were doctors and those who were not, and the arrogance of the haves and the humiliation of the have-nots. In educational environments, the correlation between social, economic, and social cultural status was known. I mean, we accompanied it. We read about the Coleman Report. We read afterwards Bourdieu and Passeron in France, Bernstein in the United Kingdom, and even in Portugal, with different consequences. In Portugal, there was this students' newspaper where a group of 3 students did an article showing the correlation between the students' origins and how it correlated with the higher status parents. Of course, the result was that they were all expelled from the university, which I hope did not happen to Coleman and so on. But your demonstration of the changes brought about these last 4 decades of neoliberal spirit and their effect, even among democratic leaders like Obama and Hillary Clinton, through the analysis of their speeches, was most interesting, and its impact on the growing political dispossession of the losers, or their lack of representatives in the political level, their growing disconnectedness, and also you show that the idea itself of meritocracy brings also a growing social erosion, polarized politics, and extreme right seeds. This showed a new way of looking at these unique situations. And although I was, as I say, amazed and surprised, it made a lot of sense. What I wonder is if this is not an unavoidable consequence of the learning society. And if you could, I wish you could expand a little bit on this. You see, during our very long dictatorship, we had, when we had the revolution in 1974, we had a short compulsory education of 6 years, following 3 different lines, 3 different types of schools, only one being considered the noble one that prepared for the following years and eventually to higher education. So, of course, the education system was a very elitist, very selective, drawn to reproduce the existing different social classes and to exclude the majority of pupils, making them and their families think that they didn't have the brains for studying. Like we said in Portuguese, não tem cabeça para estudos, and justifying, legitimating social reproduction and the arrogance of winners and the humiliation of losers. A few examples of social upward mobility were used as evidence of schools' neutral role. In these 49 years of democracy that we are now celebrating, there were huge changes in this school. The function given to the educational system was to be for all, to accomplish the right of every child to education. Compulsory education rose from 6 to 12 years, or up to 18 years of age. Preschools, which hardly existed in 1974, now receive more than 90% of the 4- and 5-year-old children. And higher education grew so much that we talk about an explosion, where, by the way, women are around 70% of more than men. Portugal accomplished these changes in these 49 years of democracy, while in other countries they took centuries to change and to take place. Of course, this meant also changing the function of education, changing an elitist system into an inclusive school that tries to attend to every child's need and interest, trying to meet students' interest, to build learning by intrinsic motivation instead of using the fear strategy that was very common in Portugal of threatening to have school failure and have to repeat the year of studies. It's a change from placing responsibility for school success on the pupils and their families to schools and teachers. And it is a very difficult thing to do. Like a friend of mine says, it's like changing the wheels of a fast-going train without being able to stop it. So it is still very polemic. Schools are often accused of not preparing pupils well enough to enter higher education, which I think illustrates the arrogance of universities you talk about, and the conflicting pressure on schools, teachers, and pupils is present. I think it's one of the reasons for some malestar, not feeling very well. For example, we have studies on health and well-being of students, of pupils. They were coordinated by Margarida Gaspar de Matos, and they are international studies, and they show how how do you say, the fact that you don't feel well, that you feel very pressured, is growing in students. It has been growing as results, academic results become better, so does this bad feeling of pupils grow, and also it grows with their age, as the smaller ones enjoy much more school than the secondary school ones. They say they feel too stressed by excessive study and classes, homework and tests. They feel pressure by parents and schools, and they feel they are constantly in a race. And I would dare say that this pressure comes from the higher education divide that you mentioned. The entry into higher education still signals an important divide. The simple fact of having higher education diploma, any higher education diploma, gives one entering, for example, one entering the civil service, the double salary in relation to one who just finished secondary school. And of course, we are still in the process of increasing the number of students in higher education. What I wonder, what my problem is, if it is possible to foster the interest in higher education without giving some kind of extrinsic rewards, so of material reward or of meritocracy. If intrinsic motivation and the desire to learn, to self-realization and to contribute to the common good is enough to sustain the will and the effort to go on studying. So that's another point that I wonder if you could expand a little. In your book, you say it is often thought that the only alternative to equality of chances is a sterile and oppressive equality of results. But you say there is another alternative, a wide equality of conditions that allows all those who do not achieve great richness or prestige situations to have a decent and dignified life in an activity that is socially valued, participating in a culture of generalized learning and taking decisions with other citizens on issues of relevance to public interest. But that reminds me of Manhattan Beach, or of my idea of what life was in Manhattan Beach. And you defend a society not of perfect equality, but of citizens who have differences, but who get together in common public places and cultivate the common good. And also this point, I don't know if you are going to answer us, but this point, if you are, I would like very much to hear you a little bit more about this equality of conditions, and also about its feasibility. Reading about this, I remember that during the pandemics, and it was already remembered here, and Anna also talked about it, we did look differently at people in the front line, not only doctors and nurses, but also those, like Anna reminded us, those that the street cleaners and those that brought the services to our homes while we took refuge at home. They went along with their jobs that were suddenly illuminated by the recognition of their social relevance. But this sudden realization has quickly faded away. Will we be able to reignite it, and how? Another important recognition the pandemic brought us was togetherness. It was often said that in spite of all the social and economic differences that became even greater and deeper during the pandemic, there was a growing awareness that we were all in this together. We were all in the same boat, and we are all in this together. And that rich countries had to help poor countries, for example, in the vaccination process. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to end it. Togetherness and the common good seem to impose themselves, even if only for selfish reasons. The same with climate changes, and Alexandre already talked about it. The challenges are global, the solutions appear to be global too. But when the word together started to appear everywhere, from the UNESCO, the most recent report by UNESCO on the futures of education is called Together, to ads from McDonald's, for example. A war broke at the doors of Europe, re-editing a fight for world power and saying, no, we are not together at all. Is this an eternal human condemnation? Or changing some aspects of education, and now in particular in higher education, could help overcome it? For example, and I can think of apparently small things that could be useful, re-evaluating the role of community service in higher education and in research, or reinforcing the participation of students both in real problems in their communities or in decision-making in their own institutions. Fostering collaboration, also Alexandre mentioned that between different areas of knowledge, fostering this collaboration instead of competition, for at least it would help decreasing the competitive pressure on pupils in compulsory education. So that we don't have to throw away, like it was said before, the baby with the water when it comes to education. And this is, for me, the biggest challenge. And I thank you very much.
So, how to respond to these remarkable commentaries and challenges? I noticed there was a common theme running through the commentaries, having to do with education and knowledge. And what is its status and what is its promise in addressing the inequalities and the polarization that we've been discussing? That seems to me a common theme in the three commentaries. And there, I noticed, and maybe I misunderstood, but there seemed to be different degrees of faith in education to address our current, the threat facing democracy, really. Because what's really at stake here, and listening to my colleagues, is figuring out whether education is the solution to the threat democracy faces, or whether it's part of the problem, or maybe both. That's what I learned from listening to these comments. Because Professor Barata Moura said that in real social and economic and political practical transformation, education does not play the leading role. And this is from a very distinguished president of Lisbon, the University of Lisbon. Education does not play the leading role. In a way, that's shocking. That was shocking to my ears. And then we... Neither the leading nor the decisive. That's even more shocking. And then we heard someone who's really devoted a lifetime to promoting and improving education, Maria Emília Brederode Santos, saying that education is a work of hope, and connecting her lifelong work in education with a powerful story from the 1950s in Manhattan Beach about what seemed to be, well, mutual respect among citizens from different walks of life, that was very powerful. And juxtaposing that to the building she witnessed coming back to Portugal with an elevator for the residents, but a sign saying that the service people should use the back stairs, which is the opposite of democratic equality of condition. And then we had Professor Alexandre Quintanilha say that in Portugal there was a faith, according to the surveys, that knowledge is able to resolve problems. But as you developed your very powerful reading of my critique of technocracy and credentialism, I was trying to figure out how you would have voted in that survey. Is knowledge able to resolve social problems? And I'm not sure how you would have voted. Because you're a distinguished scientist informed by the scientist's conviction and belief in fact and knowledge. And yet, you seem to think there was a problem with the faith that knowledge can solve. Do I have it right? So, really, there are three different perspectives here about whether education is the answer or the problem to the danger democracy is facing. And it seems to me that, well, here's just a response to the common thread First on science, especially in the debate about climate change. Now, I've heard a lot of scientists who have the kind of hubris about science, delivering judgments on high, that is not a hubris. I heard, Alexandra, from you. You have a much more nuanced and generous view about the relation of knowledge to public problems, which I admire because the impasse over the politics of climate change, I think, has to do exactly with the sense among many citizens, including many without a university degree, that they can't trust elites. And that skepticism is actually well-founded. It's understandable and legitimate. Because going back to the last 4 decades we've been examining, we've heard experts tell us that enacting the precepts of orthodox neoliberal globalization will make everybody better off. And they persuaded the mainstream parties of that. And they said, yes, there will be some who will lose when we outsource jobs and deregulate the economy and so on, and force free capital flows across borders. But the gains to the winners will be enough to offset the loss to the losers. The problem is, there were gains to the winners, but the compensation to those who lost out never arrived. And so the advice of these experts, it didn't turn out so well for the majority of people whose wages stagnated and many of whose jobs were lost, for 50 to 60% of the population during this time. And this carries over into the debate about climate. It carried over into the debate about the pandemic, when medical and public health expertise had been discredited, not so much in Portugal, but in many countries, including mine. And I think it's a holdover from the discrediting of experts. And so the answer can't just be to double down on a technocratic approach to climate change. I've heard a lot of scientists who lack your kind of wisdom, who say, we've told people, and they're not listening to us. And what is wrong with them that they're not listening to us? But that attitude is part of the problem. And as for the role of higher education, see, I think I disagree somewhat with Professor Barata Moura. I think I would agree that higher education as it currently exists, given the role that it currently plays, cannot play a leading role in social transformation. I agree with that. But then let's reconceive how we conceive education, so that there can be more of a continuity between the kinds of social movements and political transformations that Professor Barata Moura speaks about, and education more broadly conceived. Here's one small example, so that the divide between practice and learning is not so stark. That's what I'm for blurring, and so here I think we agree. Here's a very concrete example.
Practice is not blind. Practice is not theoretical blind or knowledge blind.
Okay.
So I think we agree.
So practice is bound up with learning and education and philosophy, for that matter. Philosophy, here we agree, I think. A lot of people think philosophy is a vocation for dreamers. You've heard that. And worse, that philosophy resides in the clouds. That philosophers have their heads in the clouds. Has anyone ever suggested that to you? Not to you. Okay. No, I mean, has it? But no one accused you of that ever. No. So, but that philosophy is only a reflection on the way the world ought to be. And so it really resides in the heavens or in the clouds, far beyond the world in which we live. But I think that's a mistaken view of philosophy. I'll come back to, let me say why in a moment, because I want to finish the thought about the continuity between learning and social transformation. One of the most powerful, the most influential labor movements in the late 19th century in the United States was called the Knights of Labor. And they were pressed, like all unions do, for better working conditions and shorter hours and safer conditions. But one of their demands was for reading rooms in factories so that workers on their breaks could read newspapers and magazines and learn about public affairs so that they could have a voice in civic life. Now, many labor movements since then have lost that connection to learning, which is a mistake, which is a loss. This is a small example of how political practice and social movements can embrace a conception of education and learning that is not detached from the world. So we're both for that.
Yeah. But the decisive is the transformation, and knowledge per se does not transform. That's the point.
Well, but I think you would equally agree that transformation per se, political action per se, is empty and directionless without certain implicit, at least, ideals. Yes?
Not ideals, but ideas.
Ideas, okay.
Not ideals.
Okay.
Not necessarily ideals.
Well, okay, yeah. See, I think there's a symmetry here. I think there's a dialectic between thinking and doing. Between thinking and doing.
Yes, but ideas, not ideals. I mean, ideals in the moral sense of you only can transform taking a model, an ideal, as the
Right.
the paradigm.
Okay, fair enough.
Not necessarily.
Fair enough. But there's a continuity or a dialectic between thinking and doing. We agree about that?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. But that suggests,
That's dangerous that you agree.
well,
Very dangerous.
but what that suggests, coming back to education and social transformation, what that suggests is that thinking is not only the province of philosophers, it's a project for democratic citizens. And doing, enacting politics, requires that every citizen be, in part, a philosopher. At least that's what I would say. That's what I would say.
Or has some kind of knowledge and fitness in his participation
Okay.
in the public debate or decisions or so.
Yeah?
So we agree again.
Well,
Shame is only
I hesitate to prolong this because the disagreement may slip away. But I would simply conclude with the observation, going back to the common thread of education, learning, and its relation to democracy and political practice and transformation. As against the view that philosophy resides in the heavens, far beyond the world in which we live, it seems to me in this discussion with the panel, but also with all of you, has borne out that philosophy belongs not in the clouds, but in the city, where citizens gather and reason together about big questions that matter, including justice, the common good, what we owe one another as citizens, and how, through cultivating the democratic art of public discourse, learning to reason together, sometimes argue together and disagree in public about big questions that matter, this is what connects the project of education, of learning, with the hope for a better kind of democratic public life. And for that, I want to thank you all very much. And to thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you. Okay. It's so good. Great. Thank you. Thank you.